Okay, here we go. While studying Roman Catholic saints in rural Mexico, I came across this poster. I received an undergraduate research grant from BYU to research the saint, Santo Turbio Romo. I'd become familiar with his iconography and the various ways in which he was usually presented, but this was shockingly different. He was now digitally transposed upon a picture that I immediately recognized, and to which I had a deep emotional response. A Mormon artistic representation of Jesus. In fact, months earlier at BYU, I attended a meet and greet with several prominent LDS artists and immediately recognized the work of Simon Dewey. From the perspective of Jesus art in general, this distinction between the different Jesuses is subtle, but from the shock and wonder of an LDS Mormon insider, this was significant. The Mormon Jesus is ontologically different from most other conceptions of the central figure of Christianity. Stemming from these theological differences and historical physical separation from mainstream American society, LDS Mormon art comes from a small but highly influential group of artists. After this experience, I began to see this so-called Mormon Jesus everywhere I traveled through Mexico and in the US-Mexican borderlands. The border is not solely a political border between nation states, but a border between two colonial legacies, each with their own distinct religious tradition that in turn has spawned its own narratives of Jesus. Yet despite these differences, this clearly points to some common aesthetic sensibilities of Jesus. This Mormon Jesus is emblazoned on a wide range of religious merchandise in Mexico, and also found strikingly on many parish and other materials from Roman Catholic sources. With more time and experience, I realized that the use of Mormon art in Mexico was part of a larger shift of Roman Catholic aesthetics away from the Baroque European aesthetics to more postmodern aesthetics that embody a distinct narrative of who Jesus is and how individuals can relate to him. These trends and even battles in the two countries over how Christ is publicly represented are not easy to gauge and are obviously super duper subjective. These billboards in Guadalajara, Mexico, show another way that this postmodern Jesus appears. Yet the Mormon Jesus in Mexico and the US-Mexican borderlands is by no means the dominant representation of Christ, but it's definitely overrepresented in many contexts. It should be noted that many Mormon representations of Jesus can be found all over the United States, especially drawing from the licensed work of artist Greg Olson, as seen here in, I kind of cropped it silly, sorry, but this is from the magazine from the Salvation Army. This paper will analyze the presence and popularity of the Mormon Jesus and describe some possible reasons why the seemingly paradoxical white Caucasian Jesus in Mexico into theories of Mormon aesthetics. Mormon aesthetics in concert with Mormon efforts to be hyper-American mainstream, but also reflects the democratization that new media and the internet and all the related technological advancements bring into the realm of religion. I find that the Mormon Jesus in Mexico is largely the result of the proliferation of images on the internet. Yet I also present the ways that the same presence on the internet inspires and bolsters a largely American narrative of Jesus satire. The same Mormon-derived images that Mexicans and many Americans use for devotional purposes become part of what are called internet memes. David Morgan's theory of popular religious images in the United States describes the, quote, visual formation and practice of religious belief as visual piety. Oops, that was supposed to be a meme. Sorry, I messed up on my slide. So here's an example of an internet meme. I'll get to more later. You may or may not see what's going on here. Visual piety. Morgan states that, quote, the act of looking itself contributes to the religious formation and indeed constitutes a powerful practice of belief, unquote. Drawing on his previous work about the highly influential artist Warner Sallman, he describes the place of the visual representations of Jesus in American culture. Using his own analysis of Latter-day Saint publications, Noel Comack places Mormon images of Jesus into the context of Morgan's larger work. He notes that Mormons have, quote, generally believed in a fair-skinned Christ, unquote. Mormons did not innovate this. Jesus has long been portrayed within the geopolitically dominant West as fair-skinned. Central to Mormon representations of Christ is gender or cultural gender markers. LDS apostle Orson F. Whitney describes a vision which he had of Jesus where he was, quote, of noble stature and majestic men, not at all the weak, effeminate being that some painters have portrayed, but the very God that was and is as meek and humble as a little child," unquote. This echoes a later vision of Christ by a Pentecostal author who also describes a modern encounter with the ancient but resurrected Jesus. Both use the word effeminate in reference to 19th century representations of Christ that are largely Catholic in origin. The 20th century produced a more masculine, modern Jesus, as seen in the works of Warner Sallman. The center picture is, of course, by Del Parson. Stephen Prothero states that this picture, in particular, debuting in the Mormon magazine Ensign in 1984, depicts Jesus as a masculine and clearly Caucasian hero. This gave way to a postmodern Jesus that exhibits both masculine and feminine characteristics. Carmack notes that Mormon artist Greg Olson embodies this most of all in his strong yet passive Christ on the end there. So really this, according to these authors, the true Mormon cutting edge innovation comes from this gender hybridization that's different from previous artists. And this is precisely the Christ that's the center of a lot of Mexican material culture. Here's some more examples. So this is I found this at Olvera Street in Los Angeles, which is sort of like a Mexican cultural center. And this is what a lot of this is. I've dozens and dozens of pictures, so I'm just going to go through a couple of them right now just to show you what I'm talking about. You can see it's a Greg Olson picture again that's photoshopped into this little thing that's supposed to be the Bible, and this doll's holding it. This is at the church that's across the street from Olvera Street. So this is basically downtown Los Angeles, and I don't know if you can notice it, but there's a Mormon picture of Jesus in the corner there. Again, photoshopped for various reasons. You can see it's in the context of other representations. These are popular Mexican religious tracts that can be found all over Mexico, usually in the fronts of parishes. Let's see if I have that slide. No. Let's see. Anyways, there's more of them. Greg Olson, again, photoshopped in the context of a devotional pamphlet, a bookmark, more devotional pamphlets. This is the point I'm trying to make with all these slides, is that it's just ubiquitous. Like once I saw it in that one poster, I started seeing it everywhere. Many of these Mormon artists enjoy popularity outside of Mormonism. Some have extensive distribution networks in the United States, like with Greg Olson. Yet the venues of obtaining this artwork in the US are not necessarily the same in Mexico. All these images are usually seen without attribution of any kind. So the place I looked to help explain this picture to me was the internet. Clearly, but perhaps still arguably, this Simon Dewey picture came from the internet. The low resolution and the sheer number of Mormon pictures on the internet is a likely source for the extensive place of these images arriving all throughout Mexico. These are visible networks through which these artists market their pictures to Mormons and non-Mormons in the United States. So this peculiar place of Mormon art on the internet really has to do with the visual nature of the internet, especially the image-rich interfaces of Web 2.0, which is kind of an outdated term now, because the internet's such a different place than it was 10 years ago, but that's when I started the research. This is the primary reason why theologically incompatible but culturally compatible visions of Jesus are freely exchanged and end up in Mexico. Once digitized, these images can be shared freely and quickly. The process of images on the internet has developed and increasingly become more sophisticated through the years. But it's never actually included the images themselves. Google searches only search the text information that's associated with the images. In this way, the search term Jesus yields all results of web pages that simply discuss some aspect of Jesus' life. This makes it more apparent that pictures of Mormon origin are aesthetically appealing to Christians at large and have no intrinsic Mormon doctrinal value on the internet. The images are used as visual representations of each adherent's particular internal conceptualizations of Jesus as expressed through language, in this case hypertext. So Googling an image is essentially searching narratives on the internet about Jesus. I don't have time to get into a lot of this kind of nitty gritty, but I've been searching, like Google searches Mexico and Google searches the United States. And again, sometimes it's overwhelmingly pictures of Mormon origin on both sides, because the searches are different in either country, but Mormons are consistently overrepresented with the pictures of Jesus that are on the internet in both countries. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is one of my favorites that I've found. So, though not a Mormon himself, Harry Anderson was commissioned by the LDS Church for many pieces that continue to be found in church publications. Here, Jesus is removed and replaced with Pope John Paul II to indicate his exalted nature as a then soon-to-be canonized saint. So now he's been canonized, but when I got this, it was in anticipation of his canonization. With the popularity of these Mormon images, coupled with their easy and free distribution over the internet, new appropriations and new religious narratives like this are being brought to pass. Responding to Noel Carmack's article on Mormon representations of Jesus, Richard Holtzapfel states that, quote, images of Christ, what we think Jesus would look like, what he would wear, how he would act, reflect more than anything else our general Western culture, unquote. But what of this fair-skinned Christ in Mexico? How does a white Mormon Jesus flourish in a largely Indian and mestizo culture? Serge Gruzinski states that, quote, wars over images are as important as ones over oil, unquote. With respect to Mexico, he continues and states that, quote, the Spanish colonial invasion released a flood of Western images onto the American continents, unquote. Yet as Gruzinski documents, the difference is that Baroque European ideals still hold sway over Mexican aesthetics of Christ, which, coincidentally, are strikingly similar to the emerging aesthetics of modern LDS Mormonism, at least in terms of whiteness. And some of those other things that we talked about, the kind of the gendered nature of the various representations of Jesus. So this other interrelated reason is that these images persist as the European aesthetic ideas that persist in Mexico and in the United States. The centuries of sometimes bloody conflicts between individuals and groups over their interpretations of Jesus are completely subsumed within the North American uses of modern conceptions. This analysis shows that images of Christ, especially Mormon ones, are found on many different websites with different theological, cultural, and secular goals. The Mormon Jesus proliferates precisely because he is what American and Mexican cultures desire, independent from one another. Yet, like the US-Mexican border itself, these cultures are linked historically through the divergent but European forms of colonialism, and economically through though balanced in favor of the United States. Generally, the cultural interaction of either side of the border is mitigated through the cultural hybridity of the borderlands and by the insular nature of immigrant communities, but the various facets of the World Wide Web, particularly through the large US corporations that determine how the internet is used, provide a quick electronic link between the shared desire for a particular cultural construction of Jesus Christ. Lisa Nakamura laments that despite any pretense of colorblindness and the banality of culture, quote, the internet is a place where race happens, unquote. For Nakamura, these types of similarities are not benign and may indicate a form of, quote, cosmetic cosmopolitanism that perpetuates a digital divide, unquote. The rhetorical spaces of and around the internet perpetuate a disorienting effect on those who see their Jesus racialized, even if it is in their own likeness. Armin Moss echoes a corollary tale of Mormon appropriations of race and culture. He writes of the, quote, inspiring irony that a modern, universalistic vision of the spiritual potential in all peoples should emerge from the parochial 19th century Mormons' visions of themselves, unquote. But as he prefaces his story of Mormon race constructions, Moss observes that, quote, stories about human beings and their institutions always involve the discovery of paradoxes and contradictions, unquote. Okay, in his classic book, The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins coins the term meme as analogous to the word gene. In this conception, the meme is a culturally based idea that is passed from one person to another and from one generation to another. But Meme, obviously, in our vernacular means something completely different. American popular culture has appropriated this term for those bits of internet culture that are sent and posted in various internet sites that become wildly popular. These memes are increasingly becoming religious in nature. This internet image appropriation exists in a world that is largely and increasingly secular. The same methods that are employed to create various narratives of Jesus are used to make fun of Jesus. Just as Mormon images serve as tools for changing conceptions of Jesus as the Savior, they exist for Jesus as a symbol of religious increasing irrelevance of religion, even scorn. Patrick Davidson states that an internet meme is a piece of culture, typically a joke, which gains influence through online transmission. He muses upon the open nature of the internet by asking, quote, "What then does the practice of anonymity offer to the individuals who enact it?" In many ways, anonymity enables a type of freedom. The freedom can have obvious personal benefits if the material one is generating, sharing, or collecting is transgressive. For those internet users who revel in the existence of racist, sexist, or otherwise offensive memes, a practice and system of anonymity protects them from the regulation or punishment that peers or authorities might attempt to enact in response to such material, unquote. In partial explanation of the unethical, if not illegal, actions of image appropriation, he states that there is an additional layer of freedom afforded by a lack of attribution. With no documented authors, there exists no intellectual property. Memes can be born, replicated, transmitted, transformed, and forwarded with no concern for rights management, monetization, citation, or licensing. Let's see. Okay, so here's just some more random ones where, and again, this is kind of a tricky subject because I find that these two things are actually linked. I'm not using them just because they're funny, but they're actually illustrate what people are doing with the images. So the minute I start trying to figure out why there's a Mormon Jesus in Mexico, it's inextricably linked, right, with just the use of internet to do stuff like this. And again, there's an overrepresentation of Mormon Jesuses in memes. There are so many variations of this, like there's just so many pictures, like I had to pick which ones were the best. Okay, then it gets more complicated. So this person's using a Greg Olson picture as like the framework for this picture. And so that brings us to this last one where there's a secondary competing portrayal of Jesus. So this actually comes straight from this miniseries from the 70s called Jesus of Nazareth. These are actual pictures that artists then just completely copy. And they're on t-shirts and they're in all the other places that the Mormon Jesus is in. And this was just a good example. There's a ton of examples of that one as well, but this one just has both of them. So these are kind of the competing forms. So this pamphlet shows the dichotomy of Jesus. Robert Powell Jesus portrays a gaunt, mystical Jesus that's intentionally created to invoke traditional Roman Catholic aesthetics. The Mormon Jesus is increasingly being embraced and used, though. This is an example of the ever-changing formation, as Morgan describes. For time's sake, so when we think about global Mormonism, let's see what I wrote here. Race is clearly important. So the Mormon Jesus in Mexico kind of highlights the importance of race, especially as the LDS Church is seen more from a global context. Official and quasi-canonical art is available from LDS venues, portrays Jesus as a Caucasian, often blue-eyed Messiah. When I was a missionary, this was the picture that I had in my flip charts, and I actually covered it up because it seemed a little too like on the nose for what I was doing. You know, I'm like the white guy, and I want to baptize a Latino guy, right? But now in my post-colonial readings of everything, it may have been equally problematic to then I copied it I put just a Harry Anderson picture over it, so that's probably equally problematic. Let's see, to conclude, very quickly, this is the next stage of this evolution is pass-along cards. So again, people are using pass-along cards as memes. So in these two pictures, so this physical material culture of Mormonism that's getting disseminated is being used in a bunch of different ways. And so like I've been showing you, it's been used in silly kind of, viral things for the internet. Unfortunately, I don't have good pictures of it. So this is just me doing ethnographic field work. So I was with these two priests from Mexico, and we were taking relics around and doing healing masses in the Central Valley several years back. And in several of the homes that I went to, there's pass-along cards, clearly that LDS missionaries had left, that the people in the house would take the pass-along cards and put it in their home altars. And so the Mormon Jesus kept popping up when I was doing ethnographic field work constantly. And then months later, I was at a taco shop in Corona, California, just south of here, and someone had done the same thing. And I asked them, where's that picture come from? And he's like, oh, you wouldn't know what it is. It's from Mexico. So, thank you.